They tied the Doberman down as her puppies were thrown into the river. But her nightmare wasn't over. I will never forget the first sound I heard that morning. A sound that wasn't a bark or a cry, but the thin, metallic scrape of wire tightening against a throat. So faint, most people would have ignored it. Yet, in that lung-cutting cold, it rang sharp as a razor dragged across glass. The Doberman, later I'd learn her name was Sable, lunged forward on a body so starved I could see every rib pushing beneath her snow-soaked coat, the wire looped twice around her neck and cinched to an old pine carving, deeper each time she pulled, letting dark blood spread across the white ground like spilled ink. And even the wind whipping through Colorado couldn't drown out the truth. She wasn't fighting, she was breaking. I stood nearly 20 meters away on the rocky trail that dropped toward Cold River Gorge, my mind taking a few stunned seconds to catch up to what my eyes already knew, while snow spun sideways and slapped my face like shards of glass. Across the ravine, perched on a narrow ledge jutting over the rushing water, two boys stood huddled together. Tyler Briggs lifting his phone like he was filming some cheap thrill, and Mason Reed with his jeans soaked to the knees, clutching something tiny in his trembling fist. A pup. A life small enough to disappear between blinks. There are moments when the body knows before the heart, before reason, as if some buried switch flips itself, and everything inside you screams one command: run. My coffee cup slipped from my hand and hit the snow with a soft pop. A ridiculous sound for the middle of a nightmare, and then my legs were already moving down the slope, sliding on ice-coated rocks, while my breath turned needle-sharp in my throat. But all I could see was Mason's arm lifting, and I knew I was too far. "Stop!" I shouted the wind, tearing my voice into pieces as the small black blur left his hand with no cry, no sound, just the faintest splash like a pebble dropped into a deep well before the river swallowed it whole. Sable made a noise I pray to God I never hear again. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a howl. It was something cracked open from the earth itself. She lunged toward the edge, her entire body drawn into one desperate line, but the wire snapped her backward so violently her front paws lifted off the ground, her neck twisting as the sound of skin tearing echoed like a dry branch breaking underfoot. I wish I could say I hesitated for even a heartbeat, that I thought through the danger or the distance, but I didn't, because by then my legs had already chosen for me, pounding harder than I knew they could. "Let him go!" I roared into the gorge. And the boys finally froze. Tyler nearly dropped his phone, while Mason stood stone still, the second pup still alive, quivering in his shaking hands like a leaf caught in a storm. I wasn't a cop or a hero or anything close. I was just Jonas Hale, a 48-year-old mechanic who lived 3 miles up the road. But none of that mattered, not when a life was begging for mercy. Sable's eyes found the river instead of me, red from cold, from exhaustion, from loss, and in that single devastated stare, I understood a language no one had taught me, a truth that wrapped itself around the inside of my ribs like a warning. What happened wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The wind from Cold River Gorge slapped across my face like a sheet of ice, carrying uneven flakes that swirled in the air like the ashes of something burned clean of emotion, and as I stepped within a few paces of the boys, my breath rose in quick bursts that vanished so fast it felt like I, too, was being pulled toward the river below. My name is Jonas Hale, 48 years old, living in a small gray pine cabin on Canyon Edge Road, where the neighbors like to joke it's only ideal if you enjoy solitude and the sound of wind clawing at your windows. And though I've never thought of myself as a hero or even a brave man, there are things in this world that once you see them you cannot unsee, cannot pretend you didn't hear, cannot pretend you were never part of it. And that day, the day I found Sable wired to that old pine, made that truth sharper than anything the cold could carve. Some moments change you before you realize you're being changed. Put him down. I said, my voice no longer raised but low and solid, the kind of sound granite would make if it could speak from inside the canyon walls. Mason took a step back, the pup in his hands, letting out a sound so faint it nearly drowned beneath the crash of water hitting stone, while Tyler held still beside him, chin lifted in that fragile swagger boys wear when their knees have already begun to shake. I moved closer, my boot slipping on the thin glaze of ice until I caught myself on a jut of rock, and when I got close enough to see the pup's eyes, round, black, mud-smeared and swollen with terror. Every other sound around us died as if sealed behind a locked door, and behind me, Sable thrashed harder. The wire carved deeper into her neck each time she lunged toward the river, but there was no rage in her stare, no frantic panic, only a fixed, silent direction toward the cold river, the place where her pup had vanished. "Set him down," I repeated, and Mason didn't speak a word, as he knelt, placing the trembling pup onto a patch of mud and snow where its tiny body shook like a leaf hammered by wind against a cliff. I crouched, sliding my hand beneath its belly, and lifting it up, it weighed so little it felt like I was holding a handful of breath. Tyler's voice cracked first. "Why? Why do you even care?" he asked, trying to sound calm, but failing. His words wobbling under the weight of what he'd just done, and I didn't answer him because I didn't need to. I just looked at him, a look long enough for him to understand that whatever he thought this was, it wasn't a stupid joke. It was cruel. I turned back to Sable, the wire soaked in blood, her skin torn open, her breath. A series of broken, rattling pulls like an old machine dying one gear at a time. With the pup held against my chest, I reached for the twisted knot and wedged my keyring beneath it. "Easy, girl," I murmured. "I'm right here." I didn't know why I said it. It felt truer than anything I'd said in years. For a split second, so small it could have been imagined, Sable's eyes shifted to mine, not begging, not threatening, just seeing me, and that alone made my hands tremble. A sharp snap broke the moment. The wire gave way, and Sable pitched forward before springing upright, not toward the boys but toward the river's edge, stopping exactly where the pup had disappeared. Her whole body vibrated like pine needles in a storm, and I had never seen grief so clearly. I'd witnessed plenty in my life: car wrecks, blizzards, people crying in shock as their world collapsed, but nothing prepared me for that look. The look of a mother who understands the world has just stolen the most precious thing she had. I pressed the pup gently against my chest and pushed on its tiny ribcage once, twice, 3 times until a thin thread of breath escaped its mouth. Sable jerked at the sound, and her eyes snapped back to mine. In that stare, I saw something I'd never fully grasped until today. She hadn't just lost. She had watched loss happen, and something inside me shifted. If I walked away now, if I let this fade like the cold wind cutting through Cold River Gorge, I would no longer be myself. The wind howled past my ear, carrying the churn of the gorge like a distant warning, and there in the snow, the cold, and the wordless anguish, a truth struck me with blade-sharp clarity. I wasn't here by coincidence. I was pulled here, and Sable's story would not end at the edge of the river. It had only just begun. The wind along the gorge shifted just as the distant wail of a siren threaded through the cold air, and before I fully understood what was happening, the shape of a white county SUV slid down the ice-slick trail and skidded to a hard stop at the edge of the rock, its flashing lights splintering across the snow in red-blue streaks, sharp as surgical steel. Deputy Claire Rowan stepped out first, short, solid, her thick jacket salted with fresh flakes, her steel blue eyes sweeping the scene before rising in alarm at the drenched pup in my arms, and the blood-stained wire coiled at the base of the pine. A second vehicle, a weathered animal control van, lurched in behind her, and Mateo Cruz climbed out with a slip lead in hand, moving with the kind of calm that didn't belong in a storm like this. Everything, suddenly, felt too quiet. Claire looked at me. "You're the one who called 911. "I am." I answered, my voice rough. She nodded once, no wasted questions, as if she already understood that this wasn't a moment for small talk or slow explanations. Mateo knelt before Sable without touching her, lowering his voice into something warm and steady like the glow of a wood stove. "Hey, Mama," he murmured. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." But Sable didn't bare her teeth, didn't bark, didn't even flinch. She simply stood, trembling like a bowstring pulled to breaking, her eyes locked on the cold river, as if the current still held part of her. And then she did something I had never seen before. Mateo extended the slip lead, not looping it, not forcing it, just offering it, and Sable lowered her head and slid into it on her own as though she understood, as though she agreed. Claire turned to the boys, Tyler Briggs, Mason Reed, and neither dared to look up as she separated them and scribbled notes while the wind tried to rip the pages from her hand. I held the pup against my chest, feeling its weak but steady breaths, while Sable glanced from the pup back to the river, lifting her front paw once placing it down, lifting again, controlled, intentional. She was pointing. I followed her gaze. A narrow bend in the river hidden behind a jut of rock where the current churned darker and deeper. Mateo caught it first. "You guys see that?" he asked, softly. Claire's eyes met mine. I nodded. "She's leading," I whispered. Claire tightened her grip on her flashlight. "We follow, only on public land. Do not cross private boundaries." Then she looked at me. "Hale, you stay in my line of sight. Don't break from the group." I nodded again, no fear, no pause, because something in Sable's eyes held me like a tether I couldn't shake. We moved out, snow stinging our faces, each gust colder than the last, while Sable walked ahead with a pace both steady and certain, as though she had traveled this path 1,000 times. Each time she paused, Claire and Mateo halted. Each time she looked back, I felt her asking us, "Are you keeping up? Do you really understand me?" The wind howled through the canyon, carrying the damp smell of rot, mixed with something thicker, heavier, something that didn't belong to winter. The smell of habitation. Or captivity. Sable led us to a sagging stretch of rusted chain-link fencing around a low patch of ground where a makeshift shelter of warped boards and faded blue tarp leaned beside an old trailer with metal scarred like it had been clawed again and again. Mateo crouched slowly. "There's something inside," he murmured. Then we heard it. A thin sound like a breath being strangled before it could rise. Not the wind, not a bird. A whimper. Sable pressed herself low, nose wedged into the gap between two rusted bars. Claire shone her light through. Deep inside the shadows, 2 tiny reflections appeared. Then 3, then 4. A steel cage. A litter of pups. My chest tightened. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't 2 foolish boys. This was a setup, an operation where someone had trapped, starved, and discarded these dogs like trash. Sable whimpered once, not from fear, not from pain, but to signal. Mateo rose, his voice colder than the wind whipping around us. "We need a warrant, right now." Sable looked at each of us. No rage, no desperation, only one message shining from her eyes. "Go. There are more. Don't leave them." And in that moment I understood something final and irreversible. I wasn't just a passerby who stumbled into a canyon. I was a witness now, woven into Sable's silent cry for help. And none of us, not one, could turn our backs anymore. I stood beside the rusted chain-link fence as Claire's radio crackled with static, the snow growing heavier and falling in thick, salt-white bursts onto the faded blue tarp of the lean-to ahead of us, while Sable pressed herself against the metal with her legs trembling and her breath drifting out in thin, ghostly strands, not in fear, but in waiting. Claire held the radio tight to her ear, her voice steady as she said, "Warrant is being signed." 3 minutes yet, the hard set of her jaw revealed what her tone refused to. Mateo stood close beside me, his hand loose on Sable's lead as he stared into the darkness of the lean-to, and when he finally spoke, "I've seen bad things before, but this smells like something that's been going on a long time." I didn't respond because I knew he was right long before he said it. Some rot doesn't show until you're standing in it. When the second cruiser slid down the snowy embankment and stopped at the fence, the ground beneath my boots seemed to dip for a heartbeat, and a young officer stepped out to hand Claire a sealed envelope she tore open with the practiced, almost brittle efficiency of someone who had done this too often. "We're going in," she said, and the gate screeched open with the sharp, stretched metal cry that hit my nose at the same moment the smell did mold, old dried meat bleach, tangled with urine, and something burnt and metallic beneath it all. It wasn't just bad, it was neglected and made into a room. Mateo raised his flashlight, its thin beam sweeping across rust-eaten cages with claw marks etched deep into the bars. Most of them empty, but not clean, not hollow, the kind of empty that still remembered the shape of what once suffered inside. Claire recorded into the mic clipped to her vest evidence unsanitary housing. Rusted cages, odor of urine and bleach, possible chemical misuse. Her voice, steady the voice of someone who'd learned to look straight at misery without flinching. Sable tugged the lead gently, not yanking or panicked, and Mateo let her guide us toward a cage in the corner where the metal door hung crooked as if it had been kicked in anger. She stepped aside and let us look. I crouched down, and in the dimness I saw 3 pups, fur matted into clumps, eyes reddened with irritation, bellies drawn tight like they'd never eaten a full meal in their lives. One of them barely able to lift its head. Mateo exhaled a rough, low "God." And I didn't have words. I only heard my own heartbeat pounding like a fist against my ribs. Claire opened the pen slowly. "Easy," she warned while Mateo lowered himself with the slip lead extended, murmuring, "Come here, sweetheart." That's it. 1 pup crawled out. Then a second. The third barely breathed. Sable lowered her head and touched her nose to each one, not pulling, not nudging, just checking them the way a mother takes inventory of the lives she still has to protect. Then she looked at me, direct, deliberate, waited. "There's more." I swallowed. "She's leading again," I said, and Mateo nodded hard. "Follow her." We circled behind the lean-to where a wooden door was propped shut with a brick, and when Claire nudged it open, a cramped shed revealed itself, dark, airless, and reeking even worse than the first space. My flashlight cut across a bowl of water covered in film, a torn bag of food and straw rotting on the floor, and against the far wall. Another female dog, older, ravaged by mange, every rib visible and sharp as fingers poking through her skin, too weak to lift her head, but still breathing, and breathing meant there was still something left to save. "Get the rescue crate," Claire barked, and the young officer sprinted with Mateo, while Sable stood in the doorway, her eyes fixed on the sick dog with the haunting recognition of someone who had survived the same darkness. Memories torn, but not defeated. When we carried all of them out into the open space beside the trailer, the cold wind swept through again with a spray of snow, and in the chaos I heard something small, a thin cry so faint it almost slipped past the storm. I slid toward the sound, skidding on ice, reaching behind a metal drum where a tiny pup shivered like it had been carved out of stone. But it was alive. I pulled it to my chest, feeling the weight of a moment the world had almost thrown away, and Mateo looked up at me, his voice low and grim. "This isn't a small case. This is a camp." Claire stood between the trailer and the lean-to, snow gathering on her shoulders as her voice dropped like rock cracking in winter. "We get them all out, everyone. None is left behind." And Sable, exhausted, bleeding, shaking, held herself tall, her dark eyes tracking every pup lifted into safety, as if to say, "I brought you here. Now finish what I started. Snow was still falling as we loaded the last crates into the Animal Haven truck, the cold wind whipping across my face like shards of gravel. Yet for the first time in that long, brutal morning, something warm threaded its way into my chest. Not hope exactly, but the unmistakable pulse of life being carried out of the place where it had been meant to end. Mateo shut the truck door with a firm clap and tapped the metal side saying Summit County, Animal Haven. 2 miles. Get in, Jonas, and I slid into the back seat, cradling the smallest pup whose trembling was so faint it felt like holding the shadow of a heartbeat nearly stolen by the gorge. I wrapped my coat around the pup and warmed it with my breath. Some things you hold because the world nearly lost them. Sable lay in the large crate at the back, the red heat lamp casting a soft glow over her torn neck, and though she didn't whine or cry, she watched, long, deep, exhausted, as if she had spent too many years guarding the gate of hell. Summit County Animal Haven sat at the edge of a small town, its gray wooden roof carrying a thick layer of snow, but inside the air was warmer than I expected, the heaters humming, and the yellow-orange lights laying soft fire-colored shapes across the concrete floor. Staff hurried toward us asking fast-riding, faster-lifting crates into small exam rooms. A rhythm of rescue had begun. A curly-haired woman tugged me by the sleeve. "You're Jonas." "That's me." "Good. Help us right away. We need hands." I didn't argue. I simply nodded. Sable was placed in a large kennel lined with cotton towels, the pups tucked into heated nests with warm water bottles beneath the blankets, and Mateo used a small dropper to feed electrolytes into the mouth of the weakest pup. It swallowed. Weakly, but it swallowed. And that tiny act was a beam of light through the thickest winter ice. "She's looking at you," Mateo said. I turned. Sable stood at the kennel bar's front legs straight, head tilted slightly, studying me with a quiet calculation I didn't dare disrupt. I didn't approach. Too many people had forced proximity on her already, so instead I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, the fragile pup curled in my hands. "I'm here," I told her softly. "You do whatever you need. Not a promise, just presence. 1 minute, 5, 10. By the 12th minute, Sable stepped closer. Then closer still. She didn't touch me, just lay down with her back resting against the bars as if to say, "I see you. That's enough." Later that afternoon, the shelter doors burst open and the wind carried snow straight into the room as Tyler and Mason walked in wearing thick coats and pale faces with Claire behind them, her voice sharp as cold iron. "You'll work here until the investigation finishes. No phones, no jokes, no pretending, just work." Tyler kept his head down. Mason stared at Sable's crate, then at his boots as if the gravel under them suddenly weighed too much. "Grab a cart," I said. They did. No argument, no excuses. For hours, they pushed food bins, changed, water-wiped cages, silent, steady, the kind of labor that forces you to confront yourself whether you like it or not. When Mason passed Sable's kennel, he stopped, and for a moment I thought he'd turn away, but instead he stood gripping the cart handle until his knuckles whitened. His voice cracked. "I'm sorry." He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Sable. But the apology dropped into the room like a pebble, into a deep lake, quiet but rippling outward. Sable flicked one ear. Sometimes that's all forgiveness needs. As night fell, people from the community arrived, bringing blankets, food, spare change from coat pockets, and a trembling determination not to let these animals suffer again. An elderly woman placed her hand on my shoulder, her eyes wet. "Don't let them go through that again," she whispered. I nodded. I didn't promise. I let my eyes speak. The weakest pup's breathing steadied as the vet used a nebulizer to open its lungs. Another pup stood on wobbly legs for a few seconds. Another nipped gently at my hand as if testing whether the world still hurt the way it remembered. And Sable. When the shelter lights dimmed, I was still sitting there, back against the wall, breath tired but firm. as Sable stepped closer with soft, snow-like footfalls. She lowered her head onto my leg, not asking, not pleading, just laying it there. A small gesture, but heavy as the Colorado mountains, and for the first time in years something I thought long dead flickered back to life inside me, trust, fragile, trembling, but alive. The morning the trial opened, Colorado's sky was so blue it looked unreal, sunlight sliding cold and silver across the snow, still clinging to the roofs of the wooden houses as I parked behind the Summit County Courthouse and stood there for a few extra seconds, not to gather courage, but to acknowledge that today was the day of confrontation. Inside, fluorescent lights washed the long hallway in a hard white glow, and Claire leaned against the wall gripping her thick case file while Mateo spoke quietly with the assistant prosecutor, both of them giving me a single nod, the kind shared by people who have already survived trenches together. We entered the courtroom, and Earl Maddox sat there with his broad shoulders hunched beneath a dull brown jacket, his eyes avoiding every gaze, looking less like a man sorry for what he'd done, and more like one who knew the rope was finally tightening. Some inevitabilities sit heavy long before they're spoken aloud. The trial began with the sharp crack of the gavel, and the DA opened with the first photographs. Blood-marked wire, the pine trunk, the rocky bank, the drag marks, followed by the video from Tyler Briggs's phone, and when the sound of water-cheap laughter and that faint splash filled the room, the whole courtroom held its breath while I tightened my hands against themselves because this was no longer memory. This was evidence, cold and irrefutable. Claire testified first, her voice sharp as steel. Scene shows a restrained female Doberman, one deceased pup, one surviving pup, and clear signs of abuse. 2 juveniles are directly involved. Then Mateo testified about the medical conditions of the dogs in the camp, the emaciation, the mange, the filthy water, the chemicals, the rusted cages, and he spoke without shaking, without anger. Just the truth. And the truth carried its own weight. Then it was my turn. I stood, resting my hand lightly on the stand. My name is Jonas Hale. That morning, hiking the Cold River Gorge Trail, I saw 2 juveniles throwing pups into the rapids. I ran down and saved one. I freed their mother, and it was her eyes fixed on that bend in the river that led us to the dog camp beneath the ridge. I didn't tell it long, only what needed saying. Everything else, the pain, the rage, the fear, was already contained in the photo of Sable being cut from the wire. Tyler and Mason were brought in after both with lowered heads and shaking voices. I'm sorry. I know what I did was wrong. No one comforted them. No one condemned them. The truth did its own shaping. Earl was called last. Trying to dodge blame, I was holding them for someone I didn't know, until the DA laid down the evidence bag, a scraped-off collar rope identical to the one that choked Sable bulk receipts of low-grade feed. The file spoke louder than he ever could. The judge studied the pages before lifting his gaze, his voice low and final. Earl Maddox is found guilty of animal cruelty, unlawful confinement, and severe violations of animal welfare standards. Jail time, fines, and permanent prohibition from owning animals. The gavel struck small in sound, but rolling through my chest like a stone tumbling down a ravine. Tyler and Mason were sentenced to community rehabilitation at the very shelter where Sable and the others had been saved. When I stepped outside, the Colorado wind cut across my face, cold clean, and for the first time since that morning in Cold River Gorge, I felt like I could fill my lungs all the way. Not because the story was over, but because finally justice stood for the lives that could never speak of the suffering done to them. Adoption days at Summit County. Animal Haven always carried a scent all their own, the clean warmth of fresh blankets, the soft touch of children's hands running through fur, the quiet weight of small hopes, so real they felt almost tangible. And that morning, with the snow finally stopped and Colorado sunlight slipping through the long windows in thin silk-like ribbons across the warm concrete, The entire shelter seemed to breathe. Sable's pups were on their feet now, stumbling around the playpen with tiny paws tapping the plastic floor like rain falling on a tin roof, filling the building with an energy I could only describe with one word: life. I stood outside Sable's kennel, my hands still cold from the wind off the parking lot, watching her with a mixture of awe and something I hadn't dared name. She was healing. Mateo stepped beside me, propping an arm against the wooden post. "Over 30 families signed up for adoption today," he said. And I answered. Good, though. My eyes never left Sable, who looked steadier, her fur still patchy in spots, but her gaze changed, less weighted, less shadowed, as if someone had relit a lantern inside her. Sarah approached from behind with her clipboard in hand, her voice soft but direct as she said, "Jonas, if you want to, this is the moment." I didn't answer right away, not because I doubted the choice, but because I needed to be certain I wasn't doing this out of pity or out of guilt or out of the rush of emotion that had surged by the cold river. Sable had survived too many people who came and went. So I knelt. I didn't call her name. I didn't reach out. I simply waited. Sable walked toward me with a slow, deliberate certainty, like she'd been weighing this decision over countless long nights. And when she stopped in front of me, her dark eyes no longer trembling, she did something I never believed I deserved. She pressed her head against my chest. No invitation needed. No coaxing. Just a quiet, devastating trust that cracked something open in me I thought had calcified years ago. "I understand," I whispered. "I'll take you home." Sarah held out the clipboard. "You're sure?" I signed the scratch of ink on paper, sounding like the close of an old chapter and the opening of another. The pups were placed into a small crate in the back of my truck, and Sable climbed into the back seat, circling once before lying down like she'd known this vehicle forever, the sunset spreading a soft orange glow across her back like the warmth of a cabin fire. The drive back along Canyon Edge Road curled through snowy ridges while I listened to Sable's steady breathing, the pups shifting softly, and felt for the first time in years that my truck wasn't carrying only me anymore. It carried a family. When I opened my front door, Sable walked in first, sniffing each corner and beam of light before turning back to me with a silent message. "This will do." I stood there longer than I meant to, letting the warmth of the cabin, the fading sunset, and the weight of the decision settle deep into me. Sable's story didn't end in a courtroom. It didn't end at the shelter. It didn't end when she pressed her head to my chest. It ended and began where every living being deserves to stand in a home with someone to trust, and a life no longer lived in fear of the dark. And for me, she reminded me of something grown-ups often forget. Cruelty is not destiny. Silence is not an option. If this story touched you, share it. Tell me about the time you saved a creature, dog, cat, bird, anything that made you a better human. And if you want to stay with me on journeys like this one, hit subscribe. Because sometimes, a small action from you can become an entire world for another life.